The American Dairy Science Association held a symposium to honor the research legacy of Dr. Bob James at their 2026 annual meeting in Milwaukee. I was honored to give a presentation at the symposium where I reviewed Bob's research legacy from the perspective of his students. I recorded this tech seminar from the presentation I prepared for the symposium as a means of making it available to those who didn't attend the conference. I hope you enjoy it. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Jim Quigley, Managing Director for CAF Notes Consulting and a former student of Bob. I want to thank the organizers of the symposium for the opportunity to wrap up today's symposium with a few thoughts about the research legacy of Dr. Bob James. Dr. Bob James has helped make modern calf and heifer management a serious technology and science-based global industry while never losing sight of the people on the farms who put that science into practice. At its simplest, Bob translated technology into better calf care. I'd like to try to put his research legacy into some perspective. Bob's career spanned one of the most dramatic periods of technological change in dairy management. Farms moved from simple labor-intensive systems towards automated data-rich and biologically informed approaches to managing animals. Bob didn't merely witness these changes, he helped producers interpret them. His work translated emerging science and technology into practical recommendations that improved calf health, calf growth, labor use, and the consistency of everyday management. The early years of Bob's time at Virginia Tech as a student, he worked in the area of colostrum IgG absorption and the role of microorganisms, including E. coli, on IgG absorption. This work was important at the time and remains so today. Of the papers that people refer to, these are among them. Mike Steele did a great job of summarizing this work. After graduating with his PhD, Bob took a faculty position at the University of West Virginia, but then moved back to Virginia Tech in 1980, where he remained until his retirement in 2016. He held a position with 60% extension with responsibilities for dairy nutrition and dairy young stock management, 25% research, young calf management and nutrition, and dairy nutrition management, and 15% teaching, applied dairy nutrition, advise of the Dairy Club, and coach the Dairy Challenge team. Here is Bob's research legacy by the numbers. 18 MS and PhD students, 33 other student committees, 48 Scopus documents, 1,143 citations, 93 co-authors, 6 book chapters, and a myriad of symposia, conferences, podcasts, videos, and blogs. Bob also had many teaching and extension responsibilities. Teaching dairy nutrition, faculty advisor to the Dairy Club, coaching the Dairy Challenge team, writing extension publications. He also supported the department by leading the relocation of the dairy farm and worked as a consultant in many parts of the world. As I mentioned previously, Bob's story is intertwined with the changing dairy industry. During the 1960s and 70s, the growth of milking parlors, bulk tanks, and larger herd sizes helped drive the adoption of greater concentrate feeding and eventually total mix rations. Many of these early feeding programs with additional grain and parlor feeding resulted in digestive upset, poor milk fat production, and low total production. TMR feeding allowed forages, grains, and supplements to be fed as a part of a balanced diet, reducing sorting and improving rumen health and nutrient delivery. Early ration decisions were often based on rules of thumb, so much grain per unit of milk, local feed availability, and crude protein needs. I must say, we've come a long way from the Pearson Square to the systems we use to balance rations today. Bob was intimately involved in that evolution, or better said, that revolution. Least cost formulation influenced TMR feeding mainly by making it practical to balance increasingly complex diets economically. Least cost formulation, including linear programming, began attracting attention in animal nutrition in the 1950s and was being discussed in livestock ration formulation by the 60s and 70s as computers became available for agricultural use. With the introduction of PC-based formulation systems, linear programming really took off. Early PC-based systems emerged in the late 1970s and 80s, shifting the animal feed industry away from mainframe computers and tedious calculations. They relied on linear programming to instantly calculate optimal ingredient blends. Examples included Mixit, Brill, UFTA, or the user-friendly feed formulation from the University of Georgia, Alex, and Concept 5. But for us calf and heifer guys, there was a problem. Few resources existed for balancing rations for growing heifers. We had little information on critical parameters such as dry matter intake, nutrient requirements, and supply. So, Bob got to work. I was his first student from 1983 to 1985, and we worked at Tech to develop dry matter intake equations for heifers in confinement. On large farms, more heifers were being raised in confinement, and few data were available to predict their intake reasonably. We published a dry matter intake equation, but more importantly, built a spreadsheet type of computer program that allowed users to evaluate rations in real time on their PC. It was immediately implemented on dairy farms all over the state of Virginia and in the Southeast. Donna Richardson followed and worked to validate the equations published a couple years prior. When the programs were used in the field, we found that heifers ate less and grew faster than we expected. Donna's work verified those observations and pointed to the fact that both our DMI predictions and nutrient requirement predictions needed adjustment. Dana Tomlinson followed Donna and did some excellent work to incorporate the concepts of both physical and metabolic control of intake, and that the breakpoint between these two systems of intake control changed as the heifer got older. Dana published a new equation that incorporated body weight, growth, and NDF as an index of feed quality. Like Donna, Dana also showed that heifers in confinement grew faster than our predictions suggested. In wrapping up this sequence of trials, Charlie Hubbard used data from multiple locations to evaluate both dry matter intake and growth. He too built a dry matter intake equation, this time including ADF as the index of ration quality. Now, throughout all these students' work, our ration evaluation program called DARE4 was updated to reflect our new findings. So what did we learn? At the end, we built useful dry matter intake equations for heifer ration formulation. Although the equations differed from student to student, the ultimate predictions were always reasonable and reasonably close to one another. We also teased out the role of fiber and energy to control voluntary intake and how this relationship changes with advancing age in heifers. We learned that heifer growth in confinement is usually greater than growth of heifers on pasture, and new requirement predictions were required. But at the end of the day, we had a workable and working system to evaluate rations for growing heifers that was being used throughout the Southeast U.S. Bob never lost track of the need, too, of continuing to support the dairy farmer in Virginia. He worked with other faculty members, Mike McGilliard, Charlie Stallings, and Dave Cole, to produce a series of papers that provided important management and financial data to support the changing industry. The period of 1990 to 1995 was a profound period of change in the dairy industry, but also an important evolution of Bob's research at Virginia Tech. The 1989 Dairy NRC had just been published, which introduced new concepts such as absorbed protein utilizing UIP and DIP, and there were calculations applicable to the growing heifer, though relatively little data were available to support their use in the field. There was a clear gap and a clear need to define and refine those concepts for dairy heifers. So, Bob got to work. Dr. Dana Tomlinson continued on with Bob after his master's to complete a PhD in animal science by looking at the role of energy and RUP, or back then called UIP, for heifers. He evaluated RUP levels from 30 to 55% of crude protein at various energy intakes. In his studies, he found that increasing RUP increased both growth and efficiency. Dana was also the first to utilize urea space measurements at Tech with growing heifers. Others of us, including Jed Heinrichs and myself, also picked up this concept and utilized it to measure heifer body composition. Greg Bethard was Bob's next student and continued the investigation into RUP and levels of energy to support greater rates of gain. In his conclusion, Greg wrote that it's necessary to feed heifers more aggressively without fattening to optimize growth and achieve reasonable ages at first calving. During this phase of research, we learned to incorporate new concepts such as UIP or RUP into heifer formulation systems. We learned that there's a whole lot more to protein than crude protein, and there were important interactions between ME and MP in the diet and heifer growth. It's interesting that our 2021 NASM recommendations address this exact issue as an important concept for heifer ration formulation. The extension publications, journal articles, and updated ration systems help producers in Virginia to better formulate their heifer diets as farms continued to get larger and more integrated, and heifers became more important to the operation. Again, Bob never lost sight of the need to support Virginia dairy farmers, and working with the faculty in the Dairy Science Department, produced a series of papers during this time to help the changing dairy industry. If you haven't noticed yet, Bob's research legacy is centered around the changing dairy industry and helping producers navigate these changes in the most profitable manner possible. The period from 1995 to 2004 was a period of upheaval in the calf and heifer world. Heifer raising and dedicated calf and heifer raising operations became an important enough industry to deserve their own representation and organization, and in 1996 the PDHGA, or Professional Dairy Heifer Growers Association, was formed. These producers needed more information about intensive feeding and decision tools to implement the information needed to optimize profitability. Also during this time, there were increasing improvements in ages at first calving, perhaps reflecting the work Bob and others had done in prior years. There was what I'm glibly calling a colostrum revolution. Researchers such as Dr. Debbie Haynes from the University of Saskatchewan were developing ways to safely and effectively produce colostrum supplements and replacers. And finally, the revolution of milk feeding that began as a collaboration between the University of Illinois, Cornell, and industry to change our dogma of limit feeding calves and weaning as early as possible. Bob knew all of these changes would profoundly affect his producers in ways that couldn't be foreseen. Another little change that occurred during this time was the introduction of this thing that we today call the Internet. The first website was at CERN in Switzerland in 1991, followed by Stanford, the University of Illinois, and others. Virginia Tech introduced their site in early 1994. It was awesome, as you can see here. During this time, Virginia Tech was a member of the NC 119 Regional Research Project that took up the challenge of creating web pages specific to dairy management. So every organization or university within the NC 119 project was tasked with developing web pages to support the growing dairy industry. It was during this period of fundamental change in the dairy industry that Greg Beathard joined Tech and produced an amazing piece of work called a microcomputer simulation to evaluate management strategies for rearing dairy replacements. His work was quite successful, and the simulations were validated with existing data to a reasonable extent. I consider this a great achievement and perhaps ahead of its time. Of course, simulations of calf and heifer growth are more and more popular, as anyone using Joukowska's calf sim model can tell you. As I mentioned previously, the calf and heifer industry was reaching a critical mass, and there was a clear need for professional representation, as well as an understanding of what was happening in the industry. Dave Winston conducted a survey of dairy farms and custom heifer growing operations in the Southeast, which was a critical piece of work to help us understand how that custom calf raising industry was growing, and more importantly, what needs they had to continue to do so. In 1996, the PDHGA formed, and both Dave and Bob were intimately involved in its development. Bob was involved for many years with what is now DCHA, and in 2003 was given the Katie Award for his service to the organization. The world of colostrum supplements and replacers was becoming a thing. Early efforts to supplement colostrum were generally poorly absorbed with only a small dose of IgG. However, companies in Canada and the US were developing technologies to produce products that were absorbable and with enough Ig to truly contribute to passive immunity. Bob's work in this area, along with graduate student Colleen Mowry, now Colleen Jones, contributed to our understanding of how to apply these products on the farm and gave producers critical information on when and how to implement these products. And now to the earthquake in the calf world. Doctors Mike Van Amberg from Cornell and Jim Drakely from the University of Illinois argued that early calf growth above conventional industry practice was more biologically normal, and that higher nutrient intake, especially with properly balanced protein and energy, could improve growth and body composition. Also, Dan Wary and the team from the University of British Columbia showed that calves offered milk ad libitum from a teat consumed more milk and grew faster than conventionally fed calves, reframing restricted milk feeding not only as growth limitation but also as a welfare issue. Bob enlisted the help of Dr. Scott Bascom, who published a landmark study on feeding levels and composition of milk replacers and whole milk for Jersey calves. Many researchers in the industry, including myself, reference this work as instrumental to understanding the true nutrient requirements for Jersey calves. This was a great piece of work. But they weren't done yet. Josette Phillips joined Bob in her master's program and conducted a series of trials with intensified feeding programs with different compositions, and found that, a big surprise, that calves fed more grew more, and that the composition of growth depended on how the milk replacer was formulated. Again, this piece of work was important to our understanding of how producers could apply this new technology of feeding milk at higher levels on their farms. So, what did we learn? First, that heifer raising industry was important and needed care to grow. Second, colostrum products were tools, and like any other, these tools needed to be applied properly and applied only when needed. Next, there's much more to milk replacer than feeding a pound of powder per day for optimal lifetime performance. Again, this important phase of Bob's career contributed to implementation of important technologies by farmers in Virginia and around the world. And not forgetting who paid his salary, Bob continued to support farmers in his state with the assistance of Fred Widener and Pat French, who completed their studies in the area of farm nutrient balance and the interactions of protein, energy, and mineral status in cattle. Let's move to the final phase of Bob's career, from 2005 to 2015, when he focused on milk quality and quantity for young calves. This timeframe was highlighted by the rapid implementation of accelerated or intensified or biologically normal feeding programs. But many questions remained. How much to feed? What about fat and protein? And can we feed a lot of waste milk? If so, how bad is bad when it comes to biosecurity? There was also a great interest in using auto feeding systems to allow higher feeding volumes spread across multiple meals per day. How do they work on farms in the Southeast? Well, lots of questions requiring lots of answers remained, and so Bob got to work. Waste milk quality was an important issue in our way of putting lipstick on that pig. Sometimes it was okay, but most times it was still a pig. Michael Scott sampled waste milk from farms in North Carolina and California to evaluate the effectiveness of pasteurization, and found both significant protocol failures as well as handling post-pasteurization that resulted in poor milk quality. Summer, as we see in the graph, also affect the quality of waste milk. And going from 10 million to 1 million, well, it's still a pig. Two students followed up from Michael's work and continued in the area of milk feeding. Kayla evaluated a number of feeding programs, and Alyssa was Bob's final student and worked on the implementation of calf auto feeders. In total, the information from Alyssa's and Kayla's research contributed greatly to our understanding of the potential and limits of feeding calves in groups. So, what did we learn during this time? First, technology, when properly applied, can improve calf welfare and farm profit. There are many ways to apply technology incorrectly, and continued on-farm training and support are essential. The increased sophistication of calf rearing requires greater communication to the industry. The net was a series of reports from Bob's group that helped guide the industry to implement technology like auto feeders and pasteurizers properly to optimize calf health and welfare. Well, we've reached the point where Bob is ready to retire from Virginia Tech and ride off into the sunset on his favorite motorcycle, right? Well, you didn't know Bob. Bob was incredibly prolific as a retired professor, author in 3 books, owner of his own consulting firm, a regular contributor at DCHA and Western Dairy Management conferences, and authoring CAF blog with the Foster Technic Company. He was also a regular on the lecture circuit with episodes of Real Science Exchange and Horde's Dairyman podcast, among many others. And publishing? Yeah, you bet. He collaborated with faculty members at Virginia Tech and served on many student committees post-retirement. He also worked with other professionals in the industry. For example, part of the consensus recommendations on colostrum feeding. Many students and their faculty advisors benefited from Bob's experience and wisdom to help them navigate their research programs. Bob was a prolific writer and speaker in his retirement, and hobnobbing with the best and the brightest, who were always happy to hear about his latest adventure on a bike or a motorcycle. Well, we've seen how Bob was a great researcher and made many great contributions to the calf and heifer industry. But his research legacy would be incomplete if we didn't consider who Bob was as a mentor to the students he advised during his time at Virginia Tech. Who was Bob as a mentor? I reached out to his former students and asked each to share with me some reflections on what it was like to work with Bob day to day in their programs. I received many responses, and for the sake of time, we'll share a few excerpts with you. Dr. Scott Bascom wrote, Bob was second to none as a mentor of graduate students. He challenged his students and pushed them to their limits because he knew this would make them better. Bob provided his PhD students with just enough guidance to keep us out of the ditch. He gave us a great deal of freedom and encouraged us to be creative. He knew that we needed to be given the opportunity to fail so that we could learn how to be successful. Bob was an academic mentor to his students, but he was far more than that. Bob took a personal interest in his students. While we were in graduate school, he was interested in our families, hobbies, and the most important things in our lives. Dr. Brittany Gevelinger wrote, Dr. James had an extremely positive effect on my professional career because he taught me how to bridge book knowledge with practicality. I appreciated that he, from the start, wanted to get to know me on a personal level. Dr. James invited me and my parents to his house for dinner, welcoming me into their home and keeping in touch. Colleen Jones. To me, Dr. James always had a larger-than-life presence. It was not just his physical stature or even that shock of thick white hair. He just had a way of filling the room with his exuberance and tales of his latest adventure. His was not a lab where you came in and were automatically plugged into an ongoing project. Instead, he started by asking what each student was interested in and then helped us identify research projects that would fit those interests. Dr. Dana Tomlinson. Dr. Bob had a remarkable ability to recognize practical experience and translate it into meaningful research questions. Bob took my background in dairy production and helped shape it into a focused heifer research program that was both rigorous and grounded in real-world application. Practicality was always central. That emphasis on applicability shaped how many of us went on to approach research, extension, and industry roles. Bob was an incredible individual with a deep commitment to improving the dairy industry and supporting those who worked within it. Because of those efforts, the dairy industry, and especially the students Bob mentored, are stronger today. Dr. Patrick French. Bob James had a significant, lasting impact on my professional career. In a perfect world, every advisee would get to experience what I experienced with him as a mentor. Bob stayed engaged with me in my career for years after I graduated, right up until his passing. He was a true academic father to me. The belief he had in his students' abilities to succeed was very similar to a biological parent's belief in their children, maybe even irrational at times. But this belief and his cheerleading helped this student overachieve. I'm forever grateful to my mentor and the academic father for the time and belief he invested in me. Elisa Dietrich Warner wrote, When I think of Dr. James, I'm reminded of his positive attitude and his many, many stories of travels and experiences with dairy producers. He always had a way of lighting up a room with a great story. As an advisor, he focused a lot on developing practical skills and critical thinking. I think I learned the most from him when he asked me questions so that I could think through the ideas and solutions. And my comments. The hallmark of Bob's mentorship was good science applied. He was never afraid of throwing you in the deep end, but was always ready with a helping hand when needed. And he never forgot the producers whom he served. His legacy will not only be the science he contributed, but to the ways he improved the lives of everyone who had the good fortune to know him. Do what's best for the calves. Through the application of his research, he improved the lives and welfare of countless young calves and heifers all over the world. We are all better for knowing Dr. James. And a final thought from his friend and colleague, Jan Zimmerich. Dear Bob, we will miss you greatly. Your legacy lives on in the calves, the farmers, and the many people whose lives you touched with your wisdom and passion. Well, I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the chance to recall and appreciate Bob's many contributions to the dairy industry. Thanks for watching.